Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, Daniel Mark Epstein, author of The Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House.
Daniel Mark Epstein, author of The Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House. Why'd you decide to write about William Franklin?
I thought that was a very important part of Benjamin Franklin's life that had been neglected. And I'm interested in the entire picture of a full-length portrait of Benjamin Franklin. And I think that of all of the aspects of Franklin's life, his private life, his relationship with his wife and his children has been underplayed. And my books always begin with questions and mysteries. And I thought that William Franklin was a very mysterious part of the portrait of Ben Franklin. So I was attracted to that.
When did he come into the picture?
Well, he was born in 1730, and Ben Franklin was 24 at the time. He was illegitimate. It was very unusual for a man of Ben Franklin's class and station in life to bring up an illegitimate child, and yet he did that. The identity of the birth mother remains a mystery, which is another fascinating part of the puzzle.
How could that be?
Very difficult. Imagine a man of that sort of prominence. By the time he was 35 years old, he was one of the best known entrepreneurs, inventors in the colonies. And he had the son that people suspected might be illegitimate and had enough enemies who would like to have dug up that dirt on him, and yet no one has ever, to this day, no one has discovered who William Franklin's birth mother really was.
Was Benjamin Franklin married when William Franklin was born?
No, he was courting Deborah Reed, who was his childhood sweetheart, but she was actually married, and her husband had disappeared, and the laws being what they were in those days, Benjamin Franklin couldn't get married to Deborah Reed until this guy showed up, or until they were divorced. So they had a common law marriage, but even that had not, they had not made that arrangement at the point when William Franklin was born. So that was quite a drama there between Deborah Reed, who eventually became his common law wife, and Benjamin Franklin over whether or not this child was going to be a part of their lives.
So was William a baby when he was introduced to Deborah?
Yes, he brought her, Benjamin Franklin brought the baby home shortly after they had taken up housekeeping together. And there he was, and she loved him, and she was a good mother to him.
So what kind of a father was Benjamin Franklin to William?
Benjamin Franklin describes himself as an indulgent father, and I think he was a very, very attentive, interested father. Benjamin Franklin was very interested in education, being self-taught and autodidact, as so many of my biographical subjects have been autodidacts. And I think that he thought of having this son as an opportunity to try out certain of his ideas about education. And he made sure that William Franklin, from the very beginning, had the best tutors. And when he was old enough, he went to a classical academy and learned Latin and Greek and horsemanship. And Benjamin Franklin really treated his adolescent son as more of a younger brother than as a son. So it was a very intimate relationship, and I think he was a very good father.
Benjamin Franklin and Deborah had a daughter together?
Later.
There's just one?
Yeah, they had one daughter. The daughter was born when William Franklin was about 10. And she was also remarkable. Very intelligent, beautiful, high-spirited. And William Franklin loved his younger sister and vice versa. And although the family endured all sorts of strife during the Revolution, William Franklin and his sister Sally remained good friends until he passed away.
And you write in your book that William Franklin was with his dad when he did the kite experiment?
Yes. And actually, I remember when I was a child seeing a woodcut of Benjamin Franklin and this little boy flying the kite together in the storm, which of course was one of the early experiments proving that lightning and electricity were the same thing. And I was very taken with that, although it's sort of misleading because actually William Franklin was 22 years old and his father in his 40s when the kite experiment actually took place. It does give an indication of how close the two of them were. They worked together in politics. They worked together in their scientific experiments. William actually made important contributions in terms of the discoveries about electricity. And I wondered when I was a little boy, what would it be like to have somebody like Benjamin Franklin as a father?
A little intimidating.
Yes, to say the least. But I think, again, Benjamin Franklin had a great deal of charm. He loved his son William, and probably was able to diffuse that sense of awe that we now think of Benjamin Franklin as being a giant. And I suspect that young William Franklin had a little more down-to-earth idea about his dad.
Did Benjamin write much about young William when he was growing up?
No, he didn't. Although there's a great deal about William in the letters, hundreds and hundreds of letters, he doesn't really write about William. He writes about him a little bit in the autobiography, particularly the two of them visiting the paternal family graveyard in England. Except for that, there's very little that he wrote about his son.
Did William get a formal education?
He did. He went to Anand's Academy in Philadelphia, which was one of the earliest academies for young men. And then when he was older, he went to he had a private tutor who taught him law, a mutual friend named Joseph Galloway. And then, of course, when he was in his 20s, studied in England to become a solicitor.
He joined the Army fairly young.
He did, and that's an interesting part of his story. He actually wanted to be a sailor first, and tried to stow away on a ship. And his father tells the story of bringing him back from the ship, and says, "Oh, it couldn't have been from mistreatment at home because I was a very indulgent father." But William clearly was very headstrong, precocious, and when he saw that he wasn't going to be able to become a mariner, he enlisted in the King's Army and fought in King George's War, which is one of the wars that led up to the French and Indian War.
When you were writing this book, how did you keep from getting carried away with one or the other biography?
Oh, that's I don't know. That's a kind of portraiture that I've learned to do over the years. This is my eighth book of history, and I've done several dual portraits. I did one of Lincoln and Whitman. I did one of Mary Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln. And you learn, part of the art of this sort of portraiture is you learn to keep the two people in the same frame. because the personality of one will illuminate the character of the other. And if you get too far on one side or the other, you lose that balance and that synergy that creates the vividness of the portrait. So it's partly a technical thing, and it's partly that I was genuinely interested in both of these men. I thought that in their way, each was extraordinary, and each made an important contribution to American history.
So much has been written about Benjamin Franklin. Were you able to find new things about him, or how would you keep it from just being a repetition of all the other things that have been written about him?
I think I found a great deal that was new simply by giving a fresh eye to the correspondence. There have been a lot of advances in contemporary scholarship, the availability of papers, letters, online. It used to be that if you wanted to read all of the correspondence between Benjamin Franklin and his son, you would have to go to the Yale Library, you would have to go to the Library of Congress and spend months there. And then when you were finished copying everything that you had out of that, when you started writing the book and you wanted to go back, you couldn't go back. And now all of this correspondence is available. It's available online. So contemporary scholars, myself included, have an opportunity to exhaustively look at these papers, and simply by concentrating on the dialogue between Benjamin Franklin and his son and their mutual friends and other family members, I was able to discover a lot of things about Benjamin Franklin that I think were not widely known.
How often would you come up with something that you'd tell your friends, hey, listen to this story about Benjamin Franklin? Or how often would you spend days and not come up with anything?
The process of research is it's a day in and day out thing, and there's some days when you'll discover a great deal that's new, and then you'll go through weeks where you'll simply be reinterpreting things that you've seen before. So it's not a matter of a special day where eureka, all the bells and whistles sound, and you've discovered that Benjamin Franklin had another mistress, or that William Franklin's son had an illegitimate child whose mother was unknown. These things they're new. They're new to scholarship and very exciting to me, but not necessarily more important than things that have already been discovered but not really understood.
What do you understand about Benjamin Franklin better now?
I understand the pressure that he was under as during the Revolution, when he was made the minister plenipotentiary to France, with the responsibility of bringing France into the alliance with the United States against the British. He had such incredible responsibilities to the government and to his own family, because remember, America was divided over during the Revolution. It was very much a civil war where there were enemies to the Loyalists and the Tories were considered enemies of the government. William Franklin chose during the Revolution to side with the British government. He was governor of New Jersey. He never stepped down from his chair in the government, and he was an enemy of the government, and therefore potentially an enemy of Benjamin Franklin and his daughter and her children. This was a very, very difficult thing for Benjamin Franklin to go through when his son was arrested and put in prison. There was nothing he could do for him because of his position in the government, and because of his responsibility to the other family members who sided with him.
How did William Franklin get to be governor of New Jersey in the first place?
Well, this goes back to the embassy that Benjamin Franklin was given during the French and Indian War. He was sent to England to lobby the Parliament to get the Penns, who were the proprietary rulers of Pennsylvania, to allow their lands to be taxed in order to contribute money to the army which would defend Pennsylvania against the Indians and the French. So Benjamin Franklin was sent as an agent for the Assembly, and he was allowed to bring his son along as an aide. And his son also was there to get his advanced education in law. And while he was there, William Franklin so endeared himself to the English Parliament and to the political powers that be that by the time he was in his mid-20s and late 20s, he was picked. He was tapped to be governor, the royal governor of New Jersey. That was an extraordinary thing for a young man at that time. And he took it very seriously. His commitment to the crown, his responsibilities as a royal governor of New Jersey, and of course that was the beginning of the division between Benjamin Franklin and his son.
How did the colonial government work there? I mean, the governor was appointed by the king, or the crown, and then how else was it governed?
Well, the governor, all of the colonies had their governors who were appointed by the crown, but I believe all of the colonial governments also had an assembly, which was popularly elected and represented the workers and the mechanics and the farmers. There was a sort of bicameral legislature in most of the colonies where there was an upper house that represented the richer people in the colony, and then there was the more popular assembly. So it was kind of similar to the bicameral government that you would have in England or in the United States.
What kind of clout did the governor have?
Well, the governor, as the representative of the crown, had not exactly veto power, but he had a great deal of power over the assembly. And there was a constant tension between these provincial assemblies and the governor, which was handled with more and less grace depending on who the governor was. And as the revolution came on, as the colonies became more and more restive and in rebellion against the crown, this job of being a colonial governor became more and more difficult.
Well, was New Jersey a proprietary state colony?
It was, yeah, it was. It was a little more complicated. New Jersey's politics was phenomenally complicated. In Pennsylvania, it was a proprietary colony, but it was all owned by the Penn family. In New Jersey, there was a proprietary colony, but the actual ownership of the land was deeded out to several different proprietors. So that was even more complicated, but I don't think I want to get into that.
One of the things you talk about in your book is the proposed colony of Vandalia. Can you explain what that was?
Well, that was a dream that nearly came true of William Franklin and his father and some other basically real estate developers to buy a whole lot of land from the Indians, to get it deeded over, which was very complicated and required. I mean, first you had to buy it from the Indians, and then you had to get the king's approval to own it. But the actual colony the proposed colony existed in the area that's now Indiana. It was huge, and the idea was that this sort of consortium of wealthy colonists and Englishmen was going to buy up this land and create yet another colony. It was kind of ironic because at the time, a lot of these people were, they were on the cusp of becoming revolutionaries, and here they were, planning to get fantastically rich by creating another proprietary colony.
Well, you're right about Benjamin Franklin wanted to undo the Penn's proprietorship in Pennsylvania and have it taken away from them, at the same time was trying to create one of his own.
Yeah, it's ironic.
So your book is The War in Ben Franklin's House. When did the war start showing first signs of the breakage?
I think one of the tragedies here is that Benjamin Franklin and William Franklin, even though Benjamin Franklin was in England, basically doing the business of a colonial agent in England, representing the American assemblies against the Parliament, and his son Benjamin was the royal governor of New Jersey, and very much on the side of the king in America. For many years, they were on the same page in that they both desired the crown and the colonial governments to make peace. They did not want an end to the empire. They did not want America to leave the empire, and they did everything in their power on both sides to compromise and to try to make things work out. But from the time of the Tax Act, the Stamp Act, which was in the 1760s, the mid 1760s, and then after the Stamp Act riots, where Americans hung all of the tax collectors in effigy, and then later the Anti-Mutiny Acts, when the British sent the troops to Boston, and then the Boston Massacre in 1770, things began to heat up, and the American colonies came closer and closer to rebellion. William sided with the king because he was the royal governor of New Jersey and took that charge very, very seriously. It was a sacred responsibility to him. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, as the representative of the Pennsylvania Assembly, the Massachusetts Assembly, the Maryland Assembly, he became more and more radicalized. So you've got the father in England, Benjamin, becoming more and more radicalized, more and more revolutionary, and his son, as royal governor of New Jersey, taking the king's part there. And they were living in different worlds. They saw different things. They had a very different idea about what would be best for the people.
Was there much of a revolutionary sentiment in New Jersey at the time, like there was in Massachusetts and Virginia?
Massachusetts was far more radical than New Jersey. New Jersey was the statistics that are generally brought forward is that during the Revolution, a third of the colonists were for revolution, a third of them were against revolution. They wanted to be loyalists, and a third were undecided. And I think that New Jersey, at best, would be considered an ideal proportion of one-third, one-third, and one-third. There were probably more royalists, there were more Tories and loyalists in New Jersey than there were in a lot of other colonies. Massachusetts, for instance, was much more radical.
Were there many incidents in New Jersey, revolutionary incidents, that William Franklin had to put down?
There were, yeah. During both the Stamp Act in the 1760s and around the time of the Boston Massacre, when the British troops fired on basically fairly innocent citizens who were protesting in Boston. During that time, there were a lot of demonstrations, some of them quite violent, in Freeport, New Jersey, in Newark, and he was involved in putting those down, not violently, but using the powers of persuasion that he had as governor to quell this revolutionary fervor in New Jersey.
Well, meanwhile, back in England, was there some moment that caused Benjamin Franklin, some incident that caused him to switch from wanting to remain an Englishman to wanting independence?
I don't know if there was a single incident. I know that one of the few times that we have on record that Benjamin Franklin was known to weep was shortly after the Boston Massacre. He had grown up in Boston, and to see these fellow citizens of his home colony slaughtered by the British, I think that was something of a turning point. So that would have been 1770. Also, around the time of the Boston Tea Party, there was an infamous incident where Benjamin Franklin allowed to be published certain letters of the governor of Massachusetts, which he thought were actually going to promote peace between the two sides, but it just caused more rancor on the part of the Bostonians, and that leading up to the Boston Tea Party caused the Parliament in England basically to accuse Benjamin Franklin of the entire revolution, and he was brought up before the Parliament. He was excoriated and sort of drummed out and made a laughingstock as a man who couldn't be trusted, a liar, someone who stole someone else's correspondence. And really, after that point, that would have been 1773, was never really welcome in England again, although he stayed a little longer after that. That place where he had been so revered, the place that he had made his home for much of his adult life, he was no longer welcome. So that might be considered something of a turning point.
Were there a lot of letters going back and forth between William and Benjamin as Benjamin started drifting toward supporting revolution?
Yes, the correspondence is ongoing. It doesn't really doesn't even subside until around the time of the Boston Tea Party, and it's fascinating because you get to see that really they're on the same page from the time of the Stamp Act. They're both saying the Stamp Act can't be good for the English, can't be good for the Americans, and they're equally horrified by the Boston Massacre in the 1770s. So you actually get to see the evolution of the change. Benjamin, in his correspondence, begins to complain more and more about the corruption of the Parliament, and you get William on his side saying, well, England doesn't have any monopoly on madness and corruption, and if you were here in America, you would see just how corrupt and crazy the American government is. So it's really fascinating to look at that correspondence and see how they gradually grow apart.
Can you see them kind of trying to persuade each other?
Yes. And up until the 1770s, William is praying every day that his father will please come home. I mean, there are a number of reasons why he wants his father to come home. He's been left, he's been left in charge of the family while Benjamin is doing his embassy in England, and also he really wants his father to return to America to make the argument. He believes that his father is the only person with sufficient gravitas and the powers of persuasion to persuade the Continental Congress not to declare independence.
I want to ask you about maybe it's jumping back a little bit, but the relationship with the Penn family, because you write in there when William was appointed governor of New Jersey, the Penns were appalled at that, and Benjamin Franklin had his issues with the Penn family, and you write a pamphlet that the Penns wrote that says became a laundry list for every charge against Franklin, however far-fetched. Here lies the man who plotted to become governor himself, who had pilfered his electrical experiments from other scientists, who had purchased his honorary degrees, who in spite of his advanced age had been an incorrigible lecher, whose son William, the well-known bastard, was the son of a kitchen wench named Barbara, and on and on. So they had a common foe in the Penn family?
They did, but actually what you were just quoting was a laundry list that came It came from an election which Benjamin Franklin actually lost to the Assembly, and this was in the I believe the 1760s, late 1760s. He came home. He got involved in local politics. He was only home for a couple of years. He ran again for the Assembly and lost. But at that time, Benjamin Franklin had made so many enemies in America for a number of reasons that there was one of these mudslinging elections for which America is infamous. And that's where that laundry list came from.
So
it wasn't generated just by the Penns. It was generated by all of the enemies of the Franklins.
when Benjamin, how many different times did Benjamin go to England?
Well, he first went in the 1750s in order to bring suit against the Penn family to make them taxable. He was there for 7 years. He went home for 2 years, and then he was returned to the Assembly of Massachusetts. Excuse me, the Assembly of Pennsylvania sent him again to England in order to try to get the Parliament out of the way, to get the colony actually adopted by the King, so that the Parliament wouldn't be involved. And that was the second embassy.
And William was with him on how many of these?
William was only with him on the first. William was there until 1762, when William was appointed governor of New Jersey. At that point, William went home. His father came home a couple of months later, and then his father returned 2 years later, while William remained as governor of New Jersey. William never went back with his father on the second embassy.
So they went years without seeing each other.
They did, yeah.
And was William involved with the Franklin family business back in Philadelphia while he was governor of New Jersey and Benjamin was in England?
No. That's sort of interesting because Franklin, of course, was an incredible entrepreneur. He had this newspaper. He had Poor Richard's Almanac. He had a stationery store. And while he was in England, his wife mostly took over those responsibilities. So although William did have a familiar responsibility, he was concerned with the welfare of his mother and his sister and their families. He was not involved with the family business.
Were there letters going back and forth between William and Deborah, Benjamin Franklin's wife, and then their daughter?
Well, after William Franklin became governor of New Jersey, he was living within a couple of hours' travel of his mother and his sister. They went back and forth. There didn't need to be a whole lot of correspondence because they were very close as a family. William was living in Burlington, New Jersey. His mother was living across the river in Philadelphia, and they spent a great deal of time together. So there didn't need to be a lot of correspondence.
With Benjamin's wife and daughter, were they involved in the revolutionary spirit at all, or did they kind of stay out of politics?
They were both very loyal to Benjamin's point of view. They loved William, but when William decided to, after 1776, when William decided to remain in the governor's seat and not to join the revolution, they were very concerned about him and they loved him, but they couldn't side with him. They really it was just too dangerous for the family members to go in William's direction. They sided with Benjamin.
So William was a sitting governor when the colonies declared independence.
Yes.
What happened then? What did he do? What actions were taken?
Well, most of the governors, colonial governors, either stepped down or became collaborators in the revolution. William Franklin was the only governor who remained in his chair. He said, "You're going to have to carry me out of here." And they literally did that. They came and got him, and he was tried by a tribunal, and he was taken to Connecticut, where he was imprisoned. He was very stubborn and was a man of principle, and believed that his responsibility to the king came first.
He was in a dungeon.
Not at the beginning. At first, he was in very comfortable quarters for a few months, but he was so angry, and he was so loyal to the king that he began writing pardons for anyone who agreed that they would consider the possibility of remaining loyal to the king. He wrote pardons for these people, so that if the British troops came to your house and you had a pardon from William Franklin, they wouldn't burn your house down. Now, this was considered completely beyond the pale. I mean, it wasn't bad enough that William Franklin had refused to leave the governor's mansion, but now, even though he'd been given some cushy sort of parole in Connecticut, he was writing these pardons. At that point, they put him in the Litchfield jail, which was one of the most horrible and sordid dungeons in America. And he was in solitary confinement there for the better part of a year, in a cell with no furniture, straw on the floor. It was horrible.
Could you tell in the correspondence between father and son when the break was? Was there anger?
Well, the break had taken place before that. In 1775, Benjamin Franklin came home from England and sat in the Continental Congress. And at that point, he tried very, very hard to persuade his son to come over to the side of the revolution, because Benjamin Franklin was a visionary. William Franklin was a practical man, a sensible man. He had reason to believe that eventually the crown would prevail in this conflict. But his father was right. His father was a visionary, and he tried to convince his son to step aside, if not to become a revolutionary, at least to go into exile in England. He tried his hardest, but William was stiff-necked and believed in the cause of the crown.
Why didn't he take the practical approach and go off to England while the revolution was happening?
Well, there were very intelligent people who believed that the revolution would fail. And in fact, 2 years into the revolution, there were still a lot of people, including George Washington, who wasn't really sure that the colonies would prevail in their revolution. And so William Franklin wasn't completely mad in remaining a loyalist. He had the strength of his convictions. I think this is one of the things we have to admire him for. He didn't give in to popular opinion. He didn't take the easy way. There were other people like William Franklin who had the strength of convictions that he had, but he was the most famous and the most influential.
But he could have made his escape to New York, that was occupied by the British, I suppose, at the time, and still fought the good fight.
He did end up in New York. He began to be a counter-revolutionary. He was the president of the Associated Loyalists, who were basically guerrilla fighters for the counter-revolution. So he did go to New York and stayed there as long as he could. But after the surrender of Cornwallis in 1782, it was pretty clear that the war was over and that he was not going to prevail.
You write, backing up to the time when William Franklin is in the dungeon, that his wife fell ill, and William asked for permission to visit his dying wife.
Yes. This is a very sad part of the story. William had a very good marriage with Elizabeth, his wife, who he met in England, and they were very devoted to each other. And after he was taken away from their home in New Jersey, she grieved for him. She was in poor health, and when she was on her deathbed, he appealed actually to George Washington. This is a wonderful letter, an eloquent letter, which I discovered, which had not been published before, in connection with William Franklin, and where he appeals to George Washington, please to let me go and visit let me out of this dungeon for long enough to see my wife.
You said he invoked his father's name in that letter.
He did, and that was one of my discoveries. It was the only letter in which in which William Franklin, during the Revolution, actually invokes his father's name, and he says, my father still loves me, and under these circumstances, I think that even he would approve of my going to visit my wife. He always loved my wife. It's a very poignant letter, and George Washington, of course, who was a very compassionate man, tried to honor that request and forwarded a letter to Congress saying, this man's wife's dying. We don't think that he really presents all that much of a danger at the moment to the Revolution. But that request was denied.
How did William eventually get out of jail?
He was visited by one of the commissioners of the prisons, and one of the responsibilities of wartime responsibilities of the penitentiaries or the prisoners is to make sure that that officers and enlisted men are given quarters and medical treatment that is befitting to their rank. And one of the commissioners came to visit William Franklin's cell in Litchfield and saw him living in such squalor, and he was so sick, he was on the verge of death. He reported this to the Congress, and steps were taken after that. There was a formal petition made to Congress, and his brother-in-law, Sally's husband, Mr. Bache, intervened on his behalf. Other people intervened on his behalf, probably Lafayette, who was at that point part of the American Army, but he was a very good friend of Benjamin Franklin's. So that there's reason to believe that Benjamin Franklin may have been very much aware of these different pieces of the puzzle that led to William's being let out of prison.
Any letters go back and forth between Benjamin and William during this time?
There couldn't be. There couldn't be any correspondence. There could not be any correspondence between Benjamin Franklin and his son at that point because of the sensitivity of Benjamin Franklin's position as the minister to France. It was far too dangerous. People were being imprisoned for having any sort of correspondence with the likes of William Franklin, loyalists, traitors, and Benjamin Franklin would not have put himself, his government, or his family in that position by corresponding with his son, and his son would not have put his father and his family in that position. And that's one of the things I learned. You asked me earlier, what did you learn about Benjamin Franklin? Well, I learned that during the Revolution, in addition to all of his other responsibilities, his government, his official duties as an emissary to France, he also had this incredible responsibility to his family. Remember, he was responsible for his grandson, William's son, William Temple Franklin, was living with him in France and working as his aide. So it was really a tragic situation for the entire family.
Speaking of Temple Franklin, he fathered a child out of wedlock, the third generation of Franklins.
Yes, in the family tradition. He had not one but two children out of wedlock. That's part of the story. That it's very complicated.
Now, William, when he was let out of jail, was it a prisoner exchange, or were there terms of his release that he wouldn't participate in the war, or what was?
There was a prisoner exchange. I believe that beyond that, it was unconditional. I think there was a prisoner exchange. He went to New York.
Joined the army?
He tried to join the British Army, and they wouldn't let him. But he became the president of the Associated Loyalists, which, as I said, was a sort of a guerrilla counter-revolutionary army. But I think that there were no conditions attached to to the prisoner exchange. He was free, basically.
What did he do when the war ended?
When the war ended, he went back to England, and really, I mean, he was no longer welcome in the United States. That's for sure. And had a very good life in England. He was highly respected, had a good pension. He remarried there.
Was he a practicing attorney in England?
No, he was retired. He was retired.
How old was he by the time all this happened?
He would have been in his 50s by the end of the war, probably his mid-50s. He lived a long life. He died in his mid-80s, and had a very good life, and was highly respected in England for what he had contributed to the revolution on the part of the crown.
Did he write anything, books or memoirs or diaries?
He didn't. There are letters. There are a lot of letters, but he was not a writer.
Did the correspondence with his father resume?
No. Another sad part of the story is you get the feeling from the correspondence and from the what's known about their last visit together. When Benjamin Franklin was finally allowed to go home and leave his position in France, he stopped in England at the Isle of Wight this would have been 1789, on his way back to America, and spent a little bit of time with William there. And William was hoping for a reconciliation and had every reason to believe from the correspondence he had with his father that his father would be open to that. But it turns out, from what we know from the diaries and letters that have recorded the details of that meeting, that it was strictly a business meeting. There was no reconciliation, that his father simply wanted William to deed over basically all of his property in America to the grandson, William Temple Franklin. So it's a very sad ending to the story.
You said you wrote how many other books?
Well, I've written 20 books.
Oh.
But eight books of biography.
What are some of your other topics?
I've written 3 books about not Benjamin Franklin. I've written 3 books about Abraham Lincoln. Probably the best known is The Lincoln's Portrait of a Marriage, about Mary and Abraham Lincoln. I wrote a biography of Bob Dylan that's a lot of people have read and talked about. I've written a biography of Nat King Cole. Who else? Edna St. Vincent Millay, the poet.
How do you choose who to write about?
I just choose topics. I choose people that fascinate me. Usually there's some sort of a mystery about them, as I mentioned earlier. The other thing I noticed, I was thinking about this before we met today, is that all of my biography subjects have been, in one way or the other, self-taught, autodidacts. Benjamin Franklin is, one of the most famous, a man who taught himself languages and mathematics, and Abraham Lincoln is another, almost entirely self-taught. Amy Semple McPherson, the evangelist, self-taught. I guess I'm fascinated by people who create themselves, and particularly American characters, because I think of Americans as being so original, and we have this marvelous history people who create themselves, like Bob Dylan. You know, there's another example of somebody who was basically self-taught and self-created.
What is your education background?
Well, I don't have any advanced degrees. Actually, I'm kind of a self.
Are you an autodidact?
I'm an autodidact. I went to college. I went to Kenyon College, and I had a wonderful education there. But after that, you know, I've taught myself Latin and Greek, and as a historian, I'm largely self-taught, which my critics love to talk about. But beyond that, usually the subjects are people that I admire. I've never written a book about somebody who I didn't like. I think that would be very difficult.
Why did you teach yourself Latin and Greek?
So that I could understand the English language. I began my career as a poet, and one of the things I learned early on is that the deep understanding of English is one of the things that makes a poet really effective. And one of the ways you go deep into your own language is to learn the roots of that language. So Latin and Greek was important to me.
Is writing a full-time job for you?
It has been for most of my life. I'm 69 now. I'm considering whether I'm going to write another book of nonfiction or whether I'll write poetry. But yes, it has been mostly a full-time job and a very pleasant one.
Can you talk about Benjamin Franklin's will and how he addressed William in his will?
Oh, this is one of the saddest parts. I mean, I mentioned their non-reconciliation, but I think one of the cruelest things that Benjamin Franklin ever did in his last will and testament, he cut his son entirely out of the will, and he left one sentence: "I leave my son only as much as he attempted to deprive me of," which is basically nothing. That seen by a lot of people as sort of the dead man's curse on his son. A very cruel thing to put in a sacred document.
We also say Benjamin Franklin always kept track of the money he lent William. And did William pay him back, or did Benjamin forgive him in his will?
Well, part of that final settlement and Benjamin Franklin insisting that his son deed all of that property over to the grandson was an attempt to settle those debts. But you know, I would say that by the time they parted company at the end, there was nothing owed on either side.
Did Benjamin ever refer to William in any writing after that?
I don't think he ever did. No, just in the will. He never forgave his son.
When we are out of time, we've been speaking to Daniel Mark Epstein. He is the author of this book, The Loyal Son, The War in Benjamin Franklin's House. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.